Prologue. Dr. Mark Ruthgar, medical doctor, doctor of philosophy, specialist in astrobiology, stepped into the comfortable Copenhagen summer night, crossed the street into the park, and with the trees partially shielding him from the city lights, looked up at what few stars he could make out. After another long day of teaching, advising, and trying to coordinate some research on new microbes brought back from the colonies, Dr. Ruthgar needed a break. Humans had developed faster-than-light (FTL) travel almost 50 years before, but the vast distances of space meant that they still hadn't spread all that far. There are only about 83 stars within 20 light-years of Earth, and only a handful of them are orbited by colonizable planets. Even traveling at 50 times the speed of light, it still takes a month to get to the nearest colony and 4 months to get to the farthest, creating a situation not unlike exploration by sailing ships centuries before. The colonizable worlds found thus far had oxygen-producing life, but nothing more sentient than moss. As Dr. Ruthgar breathed in the cool summer air and stared up at a group of stars in the vicinity of the constellation Cygnus, he had no way of knowing that he was looking right at the first contact between humans and another sentient species, taking place near a small yellow star 25 light-years away. It would be another 6 months before news of the Dawnflower incident reached Earth. Dawnflower. Master Sensor Operator Nolder is sitting in his cabin, pondering a framed picture of his daughter, Nala. The picture, taken some 6 years earlier, shows her standing on the porch of their home back on Raladan. Nolder's home was typical of single-family residences. All across the Rolati homeworld, a mostly underground structure accessed through an above-ground cupola, surrounded by a covered porch. The railing along the east side of Nolder's porch supported a vine called a dawnflower. Nolder came up to the porch nearly every morning to watch the flowers on the vines slowly unfold into the light of the rising sun. When fully opened, the 8 violet petals formed a flower the size of Nolder's hand, with his 4 fingers and 2 opposable thumbs spread out. The flowers tracked the sun until mid-morning, when in the rising heat, the petals rolled back up again until the next morning. Since Raladan has no axial tilt, it has no seasons, and the dawnflower blooms anew every sunny day, all year long. For this reason, the Rolati people view the dawnflower as a symbol of a new morning of hope. On the morning of the picture, their last morning in that house, Nala came up to join him. Rolati have 2 legs, 2 arms, 2 rather widely spaced eyes, and a thin layer of fur, the same light brown color as the dust of the plains. In the picture, Nala was wearing casual pants and a blouse of the same violet as the dawnflowers beside her. Nolder takes a breath, gently sets the picture aside, and reports to duty on the bridge. A challenge of FTL travel is that space is really vast, and there is an exponential relationship between velocity and the reactant mass required to maintain that velocity. It's not like sublight travel where it takes energy to reach a velocity and then you coast at that velocity. In FTL, space itself causes drag. If you are traveling from one known point to another, you can figure out how much reactant you're going to need. But deep space exploration is very limited if you only have a fixed amount of reactant. This ship, the Dawnflower, was purpose-built for deep space exploration, and it solves the range problem by collecting more reactant mass from each star it visits. The Dawnflower has been in orbit in the habitable zone of an unnamed yellow dwarf star for 15 days now, its 8 gossamer-thin collectors radiating outward, like the petals of the ship's namesake flower, always facing the sun, sifting through the solar wind, to select the small percentage of particles that were of the right kind to form the needed reactant mass. In 5 more days, the ship will have collected a full supply and be ready to move on to the next star. With its enormous engines, the Dawnflower can move extraordinarily fast between stars, but then needs to take many days depending on the star to reload. Like nearly all Rolati ships, the Dawnflower is unarmed, and the Rolati built it with the idea that it could simply outrun any threats it might encounter. The Dawnflower has currently been out for 2 years, and will be returning home in another 60 days or so. On this voyage, they have already investigated 12 different star systems, a couple of which had interesting planets, but most of which didn't, and were now 10 light-years rimward of Runalog, the Rolati colony world that itself is 20 light-years rimward from Raladan. As Nolder took his seat on the bridge, Pedal Control Officer Nagler maintained a casual vigil over her status displays, occasionally reaching around the growing belly of her advanced pregnancy to make a few minor optimizations. As she did so, she couldn't help but look tenderly aside at Nolder, the father of her child. Both Nagler and Nolder were getting a little old for starting a new family, and both had now adult children from prior pairings, but this voyage had been long, and when it was over, both of them thought about early retirement and settling down planetside. They may be getting older, but, thought Nagler, Nolder is still a very handsome Rolati, his dust-tan fur not yet showing a trace of gray, even around his jaw. Nolder was currently idly adjusting the sensor arrays to scan the far reaches of the current solar system. He had long since investigated the uninhabitable and largely uninteresting planets and space debris of the inner system, and now turned the ship's sensors outward, all the while fully aware of Nagler's attention. All of Nagler and Nolder's furtive glances, shared smiles and dreamy introspection, came to an abrupt halt when Nolder's sensors lit up. Another ship had just dropped out of FTL. Just inside the heliopause, and it couldn't be a Rolati ship, not out here. Nolder called out, "New contact. Unknown vessel has entered the system." Captain Nabin directed Nagler to initiate the now seemingly long process of folding in the massive collectors, just in case the ship had to maneuver, and moved to look over Nolder's shoulder. Minutes later, eyes wide and ears pressed tight against his head, Nolder reported, "Captain, they entered the system 0.3 radians around from us at a distance of nearly 15 billion kilometers, just inside the heliopause. Within 15 minutes, they adjusted to an intercept course. Captain, we were sunward, stationary and hardly emitting at all, and yet they detected us almost immediately. We have been sitting here for 15 days, plenty of time for our image to project out there, but it will be another 13 hours before the light from them reaches us. I think we can assume that they have better sensors than us, and more information for those sensors to pick up." Captain Nabin responded by directing the helm that as soon as the collectors were secure, the Dawn Flower shall head out of the gravity well. Physics and the vast distances of space are immutable and unforgiving. Once the Dawn Flower was ready to break orbit, it still took a full day to accelerate and climb out of the gravity well of the Yellow Dwarf, even with those massive engines. During that time, the unknown ship adjusted its intercept course and used a slingshot maneuver to close the distance considerably. This gave Nold his first really good look at their pursuer, and the news was not good. Nold, Captain Nabin, and half the bridge crew were gathered around Nold's displays. As he reported, "This is a completely alien ship. I'm speculating, but my best guess is that these bumps around the front of the ship suggest a vast, multi-technology sensor network, which is consistent with their early detection of us. These protrusions here, and again over here are reminiscent of a weapon I've seen before, except much larger. My guess is we are looking at a predator, a really big predator. The good news is that I don't see anything that looks like collectors, so they may be fuel limited. And the size of their engines compared to their overall mass suggests that their top speed in FTL may be less than half of the Dawn Flower." "So we run," said Captain Nabin. They did not know where the alien ship came from, and did not want to risk running right into its home system. Captain Nabin made the decision to retreat to the Red Dwarf system they had explored previously, even though it was not the closest option. The moment they got close enough to the heliopause of the Yellow Star, he ordered FTL at maximum speed. This would consume a ludicrous amount of their collected reactant mass, but getting away from the alien ship was paramount. The Dawn Flower was unarmed, while if Nold was right in his analysis, the thing pursuing them was a veritable pincushion of weapons. It only took a couple of days to get to the Red Dwarf, and another day to maneuver as close as they dared to maximize collection. The massive petals were unfolded, and the crew sat back to wait. Red Dwarfs were frustratingly dim in the amount of reactant in their solar winds, so full recharge was going to take upwards of 40 days. 30 days in, the new contact alarm again sounded. There, on the edge of the heliopause at the exact point that the Dawn Flower had entered the system, that same alien ship emerged from FTL. "How?" hissed Captain Nabin. "Somehow they figured out our exact trajectory. Perhaps based on our last vector prior to FTL?" suggested Nagler. Captain Nabin pondered that possibility while the collector was being stowed once again. "Helm, plot a course for that nearest blue giant and calculate the 1/3 point. We will do an in-FTL hard turn and proceed back to that yellow star. We don't want to keep backtracking our outward path and risk inadvertently leading these whatever they are to run along. Turns in FTL, as in sublight, burn as much fuel as linear accelerations, so the Dawn Flower was forced to proceed at well less than maximum speed after the turn to conserve reactant mass. Even still, it arrived back at the yellow star nearly depleted. They unfolded the collectors as soon as they exited FTL to capture every additional particle, even as they worked their way to a more advantageous location deeper in the gravity well. Maneuvering with the fragile collectors deployed was risky, but the captain and crew were rattled. Everybody hoped Nagler's suggestion was correct and the thing pursuing them would continue onto the blue giant, but what if it actually could detect the FTL trail? The Roddy didn't have the technology to do that, but that didn't mean someone else wouldn't. All of the predators the Roddy had ever encountered in the past always hunted the same way, sneak up as close to their prey as they could, and then make a fast dash to close the distance. Always before, if the prey could get a head start, the predator would just give up. Captain Nabin was trying to get his head around a pursuer that actively followed his trail, slowly for sure, but relentlessly. The Dawnflower was not built to escape such a thing. Only 8 days later, their worst fears were confirmed when the alien ship once again appeared, this time radiating them with long-wave electromagnetic energy as soon as only light hours short of the heliopause of their destination, and dropped back into normal space. The crew desperately tried to unfurl the collectors, but there wasn't enough power left and the effort drained their last reserves. As system after system shut down, the Dawnflower grew dark and cooled off. Huddled together with Nagler in his arms, Nold reflected that his daughter, Nala, back home, would never know that she had a little sister. One by one in the blackness and silence, the Roddy succumbed to the cold. Nagler, Nold, and their unborn child were frozen solid, still huddled together when days later, the alien ship appeared beside the Dawnflower. There was nobody left to witness a small shuttle from their pursuer attach itself to the Dawnflower, penetrate the pressure hull and inject a small robot inside. Petrol, aboard the Anglo-Euro Union deep space exploration ship, Petrol, 25 light-years hubward from Earth. Captain Joan Gwyn stared at the ghostly images being returned as Officer David Micronagata, Boomer, to anybody that knew him, carefully maneuvered the robot through the alien ship. Closed doors had to be cut through because there was no power to open them. Corpses, alien bodies, the first spacefaring aliens ever discovered by humans, and they were all dead. Many of the bodies were still at their stations, forming a haunting image in the darkness. Water vapor had long since frozen and coated the bodies with a sparkling sheen of ice. Temperatures were so cold that the carbon dioxide was starting to freeze out of the atmosphere. In the dark of interstellar space, it would get much colder still. There wasn't a dry eye on the bridge of the Petrel as captain and crew took in the tragic scene. How had first contact gone so horribly wrong? Standing beside Captain Nguyen in silence, information specialist Almazy Mwangi wrapped her hand around his. I was braced for, I don't know, little gray men with big heads or even Cthulhu, whispered Captain Nguyen, but not this. I grew up in southern Nebraska and to me these look like prairie dogs. Human-sized intelligent bipedal prairie dogs. Specialist Mwangi held his hand tighter. Yes, monsters I could handle, but these are cute. 10 weeks earlier. The Petrel was an older model long-range frigate left over from the Separatist War. The first Separatist War, thought Captain Nguyen, because you just know there are going to be more. Humans will never stop forming factions if only to have something to fight about. It belonged to the Anglo-Euro Union, but by convention, every faction shared all deep space knowledge, so it was not unusual that the Petrel's crew included a few members from other factions. The Petrel could do in excess of 100C for a short period, but it was its ability to do 50C for a couple of years. On one enormous load of reactant mass that made it ideal for these kinds of missions. It had been out for nearly 10 months now, working its way hubward along the Orion Spur, and Captain Nguyen was thinking that they would turn back and rendezvous with a tanker after exploring maybe one or two more star systems. They had mapped several systems with useful resources. 2 systems with planets that could be seeded with primitive life to kickstart the formation of a usable atmosphere if you don't mind making 10,000-year plans. And 1 system with a planet that already had water, photosynthetic life, and a usable atmosphere. Back near Earth. At least 1 colony ship will surely be assembled for that one, Captain Nguyen reminisced. Time in transit dragged. The captain was bored. The crew was bored. They were coming up on yet another star. At least this one was a rather promising yellow dwarf. The Petrel dropped out of FTL just inside the heliopause and began scanning for planets and other basic features, as well as radio frequency transmissions, FTL wakes, and other evidence that the system might be occupied. All standard procedures when entering a new system. Even still, they would have missed the alien artifact drifting silently in the habitable zone. If it weren't for those incredibly huge petals radiating from it like a cosmic purple daisy. The bridge of the Petrel erupted with excitement. An alien spacefaring race. At first, the bridge crew thought it was a space station of some kind. It wasn't clear if the Petrel had been spotted, or if the alien object was armed or perhaps had company lurking about. They approached with stealthy caution. Then the unexpected. The artifact gracefully folded those beautiful petals and moved, or rather bolted for the heliopause. When it got there, it burst into FTL, leaving an impressive wake behind. The Petrel's sensor officers gasped. That alien artifact was a spaceship and it was fast. Everybody on the Petrel's bridge just stared for a while in awed silence at the place where the alien ship had been. Finally, Captain Ingwin ordered, "Go after them. Let's see where they lead us. Make speed 50C. It could be a long chase." Once the Petrel was underway, the sensor operators kept busy looking for the telltale traces of reactant exhaust and disturbed dark matter that characterized an FTL drive wake. The alien ship was moving in excess of 200C, so following the wake was not hard. But if it was heading to the red dwarf that the trail suggested, the Petrel would get there weeks later. During the transit, various experts on the Petrel went over what little data they had managed to collect in the brief encounter to try to make sense of the alien ship, and the results were confusing. By modeling the acceleration of the ship prior to FTL and the propulsive material ejected, they could get a pretty good estimate of the ship's mass. But the ship was light. It couldn't be carrying enough reactant to sustain the observed FTL velocity for more than a few days. It was a mystery. Maybe the pedals had something to do with it. The crew became all the more eager to meet these strange new aliens. The Petrel was going to achieve first contact. At the red dwarf, the pattern repeated. The alien ship was there with its daisy petals unfolded, but again as soon as it detected the Petrel, it bolted. This time, following it was a little trickier. Instead of going directly to the blue giant as the wake suggested, it doubled back towards the yellow dwarf and slowed down, leaving a much smaller and harder to follow wake. Very clever, thought Captain Ingwin. The Petrel lost several days at the point of the turn before it reacquired the trail. Back at the yellow dwarf, the pattern repeated again, but something seemed to be off. It was hard to put into words. More of a feeling, really. But it seemed to the sensor operators on the Petrel that the alien vessel was not executing its operations as precisely anymore, and its transition to FTL was sloppy. Then 10 weeks into the chase, the Petrel lost the trail. One moment, the FTL wake was in front of them, and then it just faded away. They circled for a while trying to find it, and then dropped out of FTL to conserve reactant. While they pondered their next move, they were shocked when they dropped into normal deep space well outside the heliopause of any star and found themselves within sensor range of the alien ship, its beautiful petals partially unfolded like a sad, wilted rose. Temperature measurements showed that the Petrel had arrived too late. There would be no first contact. Instead, pilot Nagata shuttled his remotely operated vehicle to the alien ship and began the investigation. He felt not unlike a tomb robber working his way through the dark passageways. The Petrel did not have the means to tow the alien spacecraft the 25 light-years back to Earth. The crew would have to collect what artifacts they could safely store, and then mark the wreckage for further investigation later. This meant weeks of carefully looting things that looked like communications gear, computers, and especially computer storage elements. Other possibly interesting technology. Samples of food and food preparation from the galley, a sample of frozen sewage from the waste disposal system. Personal effects that might offer clues to an alien culture, and 2 corpses. The bodies they chose were a couple locked in a frozen embrace. This would hopefully give the biologists clues to any gender differentiation within this species. The ROV was a relic from the Petrel's time in the Separatist War, and nobody was expecting to be in the position of taking on alien artifacts, so the crew had to improvise biohazard protocols as best they could. This meant, Part 2 Killdeer, that some of the alien ship's logs could be replayed. This was jumped on by linguists who, by comparing the aliens' logs of the encounter with the Petrel's logs of the encounter, were able to construct a sort of Rosetta Stone for the alien language. This in turn led to learning the ship's name, Dawnflower, the names of the crew, how their communications equipment worked, how their star charts worked, and much, much more. Humans now knew where the Relati-occupied planets were and how to communicate with them. It also caused bureaucrats and intelligence services across the factions to realize how vulnerable humans were to other aliens capturing a human ship. There were going to have to be some serious redesigns for future deep space ships. Another set of breakthroughs came from a team headed up by Danish physician and biologist, Mark Ruthgar and his team. The frozen pair brought back were indeed a middle-aged male and female, named Nolder and Nagla, according to the linguists, and the female was pregnant. This gave the biologists an unexpected bonanza of information about anatomy and reproduction, as well as tissues for understanding what diseases the Relati carried, not that many actually, and what human diseases could transfer to and hurt Relati. Whoa, it's a good thing humans didn't discover a planet first. Earth produces some horrendous bugs. It took months to come up with decontamination treatments and protocols before any human would be able to approach Relati space. New policy: deep space exploration vessels will henceforth be required to have a fully equipped biolab and staff to evaluate the biological hazards between humans and newly contacted aliens in situ. The petrol having to come all the way back to human space was, in retrospect, incredibly irresponsible. Yet another finding from the investigation focused on why the first contact went so badly in the first place. Captain Nguyen was gratified that he had not actually done anything wrong. It turns out that strolling around space with heavy weapons hanging out everywhere doesn't endear you to anybody. New policy: future deep space ships would holster their big guns. Hide and seek. At about the same time that the petrol was arriving back at Earth, 55 light years away, Nala became the Relati equivalent of a full professor of zoology. Her final thesis was about the communal behavior of a small hyperactive omnivore. A human might have mistaken it for a weasel that lives in the forests north of the temperate grasslands of Reladon. This was a particularly tough environment in which to do research because of the limited visibility and claustrophobic closeness of the forest, the cooler temperatures, the jumble of fallen trees and vegetation, the many hidden predators, basically everything that made a forest different from the wide open grasslands that most Relati prefer. As a result, Nala found her field of study had little competition and lots of opportunities for discovery. By the time Nala had been the Relati equivalent of a full professor for 2 years, she had already published 7 papers. 5 of them were about the social behavior of woodland predators. 1 was about survival in the northern forest, and 1 was about strategies for tracking and observing predators in their natural environment. Nala had also become proficient at moving silently, avoiding being seen by her subjects, and defending herself when necessary. Whenever she went into the forest, she always carried basic survival gear, a small, quiet plasma gun, and a larger and very sharp knife. But even as her skill and confidence in the forest grew, she still had nightmares about spacecraft exploding, the harmonic of FTL drives failing, and despoilers closing in. The response from the scholarly community was not exactly what Nala had hoped. The Relati were creatures of the prairie and generally not comfortable with going into the forest. So, Nala's forays, and especially her interest in predators, were disapproved of as weird. Funding was hard to come by. The critical need for funding was why Nala paid any attention at all. When Nissel, the son of Nigan, a powerful oligarch and head of the Relati Asida syndicate, contacted her with an offer of funding, desperation and maybe just a little naivete allowed her to overlook concerning details. Nissel wanted Nala to take him and his entourage with her into the forest and play tour guide as if they were in a zoo. Nissel had that special entitlement that only the children of the very rich have, and he was absolutely certain that the elements themselves would bend to his whim. It became clear very quickly that Nala would really have to stay on her toes just to keep that arrogant buffoon and his clown show alive. Nissel even had opinions about which way they should go and forced the group through some thoroughly unnecessary terrain challenges, of which thorns and stinging plants were only the beginning. However, once Nissel was ready to call a stop for the night relatively early in the afternoon, fortunately, since he wasn't exactly used to hard exercise, Nala managed to get some of the less dim members of the entourage to help build a sort of fence and clear an area within it, offering some protection against the creatures of the night. Finally, when everything seemed less of a mess, Nala took the opportunity to slip off into the woods and try. Curiosity and anger combined to make her track and observe them as she would any other group of animals, staying quiet, out of sight, and to the side of their trail. An hour or so later, the group came to the edge of an artificial clearing where another group was camping. Nala found herself an observation point, a little to the south of Nissel, just in time to see Nissel's group, using a depression in the clearing as cover, move up close to the other group. From their vantage point, they charged forward in a broad line, and without a yell or word, systematically executed the 12 or so men and women they found there. Nala had no idea what this was all about, but this was not the time to find out. She slipped back into the forest and ran back to the encampment, much faster and quieter than Nissel's team would be able to follow. Once there, evading the 2 remaining guards, she gathered what few items she would need and faded back into the trees. Nala was certain at that moment that if Nissel ever saw her again, she was dead. She slipped silently off into the forest, leaving Nissel and his entourage to their fate with the predators of the forest. On the off chance that Nissel or any of his people somehow made it out alive, she went cross-country for days heading for one of the lesser spaceports. There, under the assumed name Nasha, the human doppelganger of the Night Dew was named the Killdeer, and the plan was to insert it into a Relati herd and try to find some despoilers. Captain Ingwin first had to take his new Killdeer to Runalog and infiltrate a herd. Supposedly, the embassy there was working on that, but he would find out more when he got there. The good news though was that he got to take a good portion of his petrol crew with him, along with that young astrobiology professor, Dr. Mark Ruthgar, just in case they collected any specimens. Captain Ingwin thought, with a touch of bitterness toward those that thought of this plan, it might be nice to meet intelligent spacefaring aliens without killing them. But at least this time his ship would be properly equipped. As the Killdeer arrived in orbit above Runalog, Captain Ingwin got his first look at the origin world of the Dawnflower. He had asked if he could carry the remains of those that died back to their home with him, but was denied. The Eladi did not yet know what had happened to the Dawnflower, and the bureaucrats back on Earth thought it best to keep things that way for as long as possible. Instead, Captain Ingwin offered a prayer for forgiveness as he stared out the viewport at the green and yellow grasslands of the world below. Thinking about those first images from inside the Dawnflower still made him melancholy. Finally, the Killdeer docked at Runalog's orbiting hub station, and the captain and Dr. Ruthgar took a Eladi shuttle to the Anglo-Euro Union trade port planetside. It didn't take long to learn that the embassy had been busy negotiating and had finally arranged that the Killdeer could join a herd in 30 days if it passed the expected inspection by the port master, and if it agreed to take a Relati representative along. Well, that was going to be tricky, thought Captain Ingwin. If his mission was a success, the Killdeer would never make it to Reladon, so what was he supposed to do with the representative? Well, first things first, the Killdeer had some extra staterooms in the front. One of them could be refitted for a Relati. And food, they would need Relati food. Well, that's what embassy staff are for. After some thought, Captain Ingwin called the Bantu Republic's embassy and asked Specialist Mwangi if she could give him some advance information about this representative. Almasi Mwangi had not heard about the Killdeer and was surprised when Captain Ingwin contacted her. After a little snooping, she decided this was a party she did not want to miss. In 6 hours, she was in his cabin negotiating for a place on his crew. 15 days later, Specialist Mwangi met alone with Captain Ingwin again. After satisfying herself that the room wasn't being monitored, she squealed, "Oh Joe, you're going to love this or hate this." Probably both. Almasi had discovered that the ambassador was being assigned by a bureaucrat named Naldik. But Minister Naldik had a problem. The insistence on a representative was a delaying tactic because she's growing very suspicious of us, but the builders have done a good job of making the Killdeer look, unmaintained. "You mean a death trap," said the captain. "Exactly," replied Almasi. "So no Relati official would take the job. Okay, where does that leave us?" "Well," said Almasi, "we need for Minister Naldik to assign someone that won't be missed. No known relatives, for instance. And someone that won't totally freak out about never setting foot on Reladon, like maybe someone that upset someone powerful." "Right." Consternation was written all over Captain Nguyen's face. "So who exactly did you find? Who did they upset? And how do we get Minister Naldik to play along? You've obviously figured all this out, and you are starting to scare me." Almasi spent the next hour telling the captain how she had entertained herself building up profiles of all 40 million Relati, and had discovered an anomaly. A laborer up north calling herself Nasha was spending her spare time writing up some excellent research on forest predators. Almasi cross-referenced them and found 7 papers that were produced by a certain professor Nala on Reladon matching the writing style. Nala disappeared from the web just before Nasha showed up on Runalog almost 2 years ago. Almasi was drawn to this anomaly because, for unspecified reasons, a group calling themselves the Relati, inaudible 4 minutes and 52 seconds. Syndicate put out a hit order on Professor Nala, and that hit order just propagated out to Runalog. I guess they finally figured out Nala wasn't on Reladon anymore. She's a very capable zoologist with no family, no friends, and a hit on her if she ever shows her face on Reladon again. I think she would be a perfect permanent representative for us, Almasi concluded. The captain pondered it for a bit. Zoology, specifically of predators. It would be nice to keep our findings alive this time. Okay, I'll work with Mark to convert half of his lab into a zoo. How do we get Naldik to assign her? The convergence of bureaucracy and network issues are what I live for, said Almasi. I'll forge a directive from her bosses on Reladon and inject it into her inbox with all the proper authentication and top clearance encryption. The communications delay assures that we will be long gone, before she can get any conflicting confirmation back. You are a very dangerous woman, said Jong-gwyn. Once en route, we offer her sanctuary. She's dead otherwise, so we're not making her any worse off. The young woman in shackles was brought into Naldika's office by 2 officers. She was not resisting and looked lost. Naldik took the key and sent the officers away. Shall I call you Nasha or Nala? Naldik asked in her politest tone with a wonderfully faked kind smile on her face. Naldik had once dreamed of being an actress and was enjoying this. Nala paled visibly, and it was clear she was not as good an actress, causing Naldik to pout a little. Nala, she continued, I have 2 problems and I believe you are the answer to both of them. 1. I have a deportation order for you from Reladon. It's a strange order in that it is stamped and authenticated from very high up, but it doesn't specify why you are being deported. It does, however, say that I am allowed discretion to use all necessary force to get you on a ship. 2. I have committed to placing a representative on a ship called the Killdeer in 2 weeks, but nobody on my staff will go near the thing. Nala, you will board the Killdeer in 2 weeks, and you will look like a lady government official when you do. If you fail to get on that ship, I will kill you. How's that for discretion to use all necessary force? Nala looked down at her hands for a bit, then slowly raised her head. Your phrasing is peculiar. I do not recognize the word Killdeer, and you said specifically, Relati. Government official, as if there were some other kind. Can you please tell me more about this ship? Naldik smiled genuinely this time and removed Nala's shackles. Then Naldik brought out videos and pictures and reports, and they talked. They talked about the night dew, they talked about the humans, and they talked about how to look and talk like a government official. The pictures of the damaged night dew were not inspiring, but Nala felt she had little choice. Over the next 2 weeks, Nala had a lot of homework to do, but she would get on that ship. Naldik was surprised when Nala told her that she was confident the humans were lying about being arboreal. Not surprised that the humans were lying, but pleasantly surprised that Nala caught it. Nala, quite by accident, you may be the best possible candidate for this job. On the scheduled day of departure, Nala, now dressed in her black Alardi government outfit and with an appropriate amount of luggage, was escorted by Naldik up to the hub station to board the Killdeer. Nala's view of the Killdeer out the station windows was not inspiring. From bow to stern, no part of the ship was free of corrosion or pockmarks. The humans didn't even paint it, she thought to herself. Even the ship's name, Night Dew, was still vaguely visible under what appeared to be stencil-painted letters in a language she didn't know. From all appearances, getting on that wreck was a creative form of suicide, but Naldik was unambiguous about her options. Still, something about the sight nagged at Nala. Ahead at the boarding gate, 3 humans stood waiting for her. Blue, black, green. The male in the blue uniform had straight black fur on the top of his head and bare, light-colored skin. With little to no fur on his exposed face, neck, and hands. He introduced himself as Captain Jong-gwyn, and formally welcomed Ambassador Nala aboard. The female in the black uniform had curly black fur falling in cascades from the top of her head to below her shoulders and bare skin on her face and hands that was nearly as dark as her fur. She introduced herself as Security Specialist Almazi Mwangi. Just call me Ms. Mwangi. Ms. Mwangi used a handheld data device to take a picture of Nala and print out a badge, and then had Nala make up and enter a personal identification code on the device. Since Nala couldn't read the symbols, she was careful to remember her pick-by-finger position. The final human, a male in a green sweater and pants that didn't look like a uniform at all, had light brown fur on his head, almost the color of Nala's, and his exposed skin was even lighter than the captain's skin. He introduced himself as Dr. Mark Ruthgar, the ship's physician and also a professor of biology. Nala, remembering that she was supposed to be an ambassador, not a zoologist, tried not to show undue interest in that last part. With introductions over, Mark picked up her bags and walked her down the concourse and into the Killdeer. For the first hour, Mark was her personal tour guide. He first took Nala to her room in the bow superstructure, and showed her how to use her badge and pick to open the door. Apparently, one of the modifications that the humans had made was that you had to be wearing your badge and enter your pick to open any door on the ship, something called 2-part authentication, and your badge would only open doors you were authorized to go through. Thus, assured Mark, only Nala and Ms. Mwangi could open the door to Nala's suite. First observation, thought Nala, humans aren't very trusting even of each other. Having mastered the door codes, they then went on to see the bridge, the galley, the relaxation rooms. Plural, Nala already knew how tedious space travel was and so on, all located in the mid-superstructure. In doing so, they passed by the service doors to 2 of the 4 massive bulk cargo holds. They walked aft past the other 2 cargo holds, but did not go into the engine compartments in the aft superstructure, as neither Mark's nor Nala's badges would let them in. After the tour, Mark and Nala spent an hour in the galley, where Mark read some menu options to her and demonstrated how to request food. Nala was surprised to see that, in addition to the food the humans were eating, the galley was also equipped with Relati menu items and Relati eating utensils designed for a species with 2 opposable thumbs on each hand, so watching Mark try to use them was hilarious. During their meal, Mark talked about himself a bit. He was a certified medical general practice doctor for the humans on the ship and had some training in Relati biologic processes as well, but he was also a professor in biology, and his other job on the ship was to study and document alien flora and fauna if and when they visited life-bearing planets. Nala thought that was a very strange profession for someone on a freighter, but hey, she was a zoologist. She decided not to comment. Mark encouraged Nala to try some of the human food and to note her opinion of it, and if it caused any ill effects, as he was trying to compile a list of mutually consumable foods to promote future trade. After their meal, Mark left Nala in her room to get settled in. Nala had been on several freighters in her early years, and she had to admit her quarters on the Kilder weren't bad. It was a bedroom, hygiene room, kitchen, sitting room suite furnished with Relati fixtures and furniture. The Relati fixtures were very thoughtful of the humans, she thought. She also noticed that they were quite new and the room was very clean, unlike the communal spaces with their ubiquitous rust patches. Speaking of clean, she discovered the cabinet in the hygiene room was well stocked with towels and soaps, and decided to try out her new fixtures, starting with a nice hot shower. With everybody aboard, the Kilder departed the dock and formed up with the rest of the herd, about 40 freighters total, including 3 lightly armed bulls. By the time Nala emerged from her shower, the herd was starting its 140-day journey to the Reliden home cluster transit. Nala quickly fell into a routine that involved spending a lot of time with Mark in the recreation rooms, trying different games and activities. Mark, with no patients requiring medical care, also had little to do, which was a relief to Nala because apparently only Mark, Ms. Mwangi and the captain spoke Relati.